Thank you to Mova Globes for sponsoring today's episode. Virginia and West Virginia, two states that were born as the same British colony, entered the Union as the same state, and share basically the same name. While these two states were at one point a single, unified state, a matter of economics, politics, and eventually secession would drive a wedge in between the two. Here's why we have the state of Virginia and the state of West Virginia today. Hello and welcome to Geography by Geoff. This week we're returning to our series on why we have multiple states with the same name. With the Dakotas and the Carolinas in the books, it's time we turn our attention to the Virginias, the last of our same name states. Also, today's story is significantly different from both the Dakotas and the Carolinas, so buckle up, it's gonna be a wild ride. But before we get to the episode, as usual, if you enjoy my videos, be sure to check out my podcast, Geography is Everything. Each week we bring you a new episode steeped in geography. And we have episodes coming up that dive deep into the geography of sneakers and the geography of bread. You can listen to both of those right here on YouTube, Substack where there's exclusive content, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. Before we get to why there are two Virginias at all, we should probably spend a little bit of time explaining how Virginia even became a thing in the first place. Unlike most states in the country, Virginia was around long before the country that would become the United States. In fact, it was really the first place the English were able to settle as they began their colonial empire in the Americas. Now, England had kind of a rough start to their American colonial adventure. An early effort in 1583 in modern-day Newfoundland, Canada was abandoned, and as the settlers sailed back to England, their boat would sink and they would perish. A second colony would be founded in Roanoke in modern-day North Carolina. But a few years later in 1590, a ship would arrive with new supplies only to find the colony completely abandoned and all the settlers gone, never to be heard from or seen again. But not once to give up, the English would persevere until they finally established a permanent base in the New World. In 1606, King James would grant a charter to two competing companies, the Plymouth Company and the London Company. The Plymouth Company was permitted to establish a colony between the 38th parallel and the 45th parallel, and the London Company was permitted to establish a colony between the 34th parallel and the 41st parallel. In the area of overlap, the two companies were not permitted to establish colonies within 100 miles of each other. During 1606, each company organized expeditions to establish settlements within the area of their rights. The Plymouth Company would establish a colony in what would ultimately become the region of New England today, while the London Company would establish the Jamestown colony in what would become the state of Virginia. Now during this time, England was competing fiercely with the likes of the Spanish, French, and Dutch for colonies along the eastern seaboard of what would become the United States. Spain had already established colonies within the modern state of Florida. France would establish a colony called Charles Fort in 1562 on the site of modern-day Charleston, South Carolina, but would ultimately abandon it before ultimately settling Quebec, Canada. And the Netherlands would issue a charter for exploration of the eastern shore for a potential colony in the early 1600s, which would eventually become the colony of New Amsterdam, better known today as New York City. Needless to say, England's ultimate rule over Virginia and the rest of the east coast of the New World was not guaranteed. By 1609, the Plymouth Company's colony in the north would fail entirely, leading to the abandonment of the Plymouth Company's charter and allowed for the London Company to take over all the overlapping areas themselves. In fact, the new charter technically granted the London Company's charter everywhere from the 34th parallel to the 39th parallel, from the Atlantic Ocean all the way to the Pacific Ocean, though nobody knew where that was at the time, and they had no way to enforce any territorial claims. This land would be called Virginia after Queen Elizabeth I, also known as the Virgin Queen. Eventually, the Plymouth Company's charter would be revoked by King James and the colony would be transferred to the Crown. Subsequent charters issued to Maryland in the north and Carolina in the south would largely establish the Virginia colony that would persist through statehood. This would include the current states of Virginia and West Virginia, but also the future state of Kentucky. Virginia today would have the honor of being the first established colony in what would become the United States. But while at one point Virginia and West Virginia might have extended all the way to the Pacific Ocean, that's not actually the case. Today they are two much smaller and separate states. But before we get to how Virginia and West Virginia became divided, if you're enjoying this video, hit that subscribe button. More fun geography videos are just a single click away. Despite the official split being centered around the pivotal event that is the Civil War, the division between what would become the two Virginias would actually begin far before. You see, the two states were very different in terms of economics and politics, which were mostly defined by the state's shared geography: fertile and flatlands in the east, and rugged mountainous terrain in the west. Economically, Western Virginia was primarily characterized by small farms with a few larger plantations sprinkled throughout. These farms were largely run by families who lived on them, in contrast to Eastern Virginia's large-scale plantation system, which was dependent on the labor of people who were enslaved. Further, the West's terrain and climate lent itself more to livestock, dairy farming, and subsistence farming, while the fertile Tidewater and Piedmont areas of Eastern Virginia were ideal for large-scale cultivation of tobacco and, later, cotton. Additionally, the Western region was home to a budding industrial economy. This would inevitably lead to a difference in politics as well. You see, Virginia's government was disproportionately controlled by the Eastern plantation-owning elite. This system was largely due to the method of apportioning seats in the state legislature, which favored the Eastern region and effectively gave the plantation owners significant power over the state's politics. This led to feelings of disenfranchisement among the people of Western Virginia, who felt their interests were not fairly represented. And this had a trickle-down effect as well. Because the East was wealthier and had far more political representation, it had far better infrastructure. The West, being far more rugged, needed better infrastructure to support its nascent population, but it rarely got much of anything. Finally, slavery also played a critical role in the growing division. By the mid-1800s, slavery was becoming less prevalent in the western parts of the state, both due to economic factors and moral opposition. This contrasted with the eastern part of the state, where slavery was deeply entrenched and central to the region's economic system. And this would all be happening during the slowly simmering buildup to the US Civil War. While everything up to this point helped sow the division between the two halves of Virginia, it would ultimately be the US Civil War that would allow for West Virginia to officially become its own state. When the Virginia Convention voted to secede from the Union in April 1861, many western counties refused to recognize this decision. As a result, they sent delegates to a convention in Wheeling in June 1861, separate from the secessionist government in Richmond. This group declared itself the legitimate government of Virginia, often referred to as the reorganized government of Virginia. This reorganized government would be recognized by the Union federal government in Washington, D.C. as the legitimate government of Virginia, which was a key factor in the statehood process. The reorganized government argued that since they were the rightful government of Virginia, they had the authority to give the necessary approval for the creation of a new state, despite being in the midst of a civil war. This group drafted a new constitution for the proposed state of West Virginia and organized a referendum on statehood in October 1861. The referendum was supported overwhelmingly in the region that would become West Virginia, but it was largely boycotted in the counties that were under Confederate control, primarily in the southeastern part of what would become a new state. The proposed state constitution was then submitted to the US Congress. This led to significant debate, particularly over the issue of slavery. The proposed constitution initially provided for a gradual emancipation of enslaved peoples within the new state, but Congress insisted on an amendment for immediate emancipation. With this amendment adopted in West Virginia's constitution, President Lincoln gave his approval to the statehood on December 31, 1862, and on June 20, 1863, West Virginia officially became the 35th state in the Union. It's important to note here that this process was fraught with legal controversy. The creation of a new state from an existing one without the consent of the original state's legislature was unprecedented and arguably unconstitutional. However, given the extraordinary circumstances of the Civil War, the process was allowed to proceed. The end of the war and the Union's victory helped solidify West Virginia's status as a state. Virginia and West Virginia today are still very different from each other, but in a weird way, they've kind of switched positions. Virginia, once a state that tried to secede, today is considered more progressive in its politics. Meanwhile, West Virginia is now a state that is deeply conservative and not likely amenable to federal programs or regulations, something they fought to keep during the Civil War. Much of this has to do with, again, the geography of both states. Virginia has far larger and more metropolitan cities than Virginia, and that leads to more progressive people overall. West Virginia, still existing along the Appalachian Mountain Range with large deposits of coal, has fewer people overall, and those that do live there are far more likely to be living in a rural area. All told, Virginia is home to over 8.6 million people, while West Virginia is home to only 1.8 million people. This would be led by the metropolitan region of Washington, D.C., which is home to about 3 million Virginians. followed by the Virginia Beach Norfolk metro area with 1.8 million people, and the Richmond metro region with about 1.3 million people. West Virginia doesn't really have any major US cities at all. In fact, its largest metropolitan region is Charleston, which is home to only about 255,000 people. If the two states were still whole today, Charleston would be only the 7th largest metro region in Virginia. That's pretty small. West Virginia is a state today. There's no doubt about that. But the way in which it became its own state is very unique. In fact, barring an actual civil war breaking out, there's a strong likelihood that West Virginia would not have existed at all. There was just no way the state legislature in Richmond was going to allow that to happen. Special thanks again to MOVA Globes for sponsoring today's episode. Now, as a geographer, I look at maps all day long, but maps are a poor representation of the world at large. A globe, however, is the perfect way to look at the world. Sitting on my desk is a beautiful green and gold globe of Earth by MOVA Globes. And while it makes for a beautiful statement piece, it's also something that brings me inspiration for my videos. MOVA globes are not like normal globes. They are powered by a first-of-its-kind technology that allows the globe to spin itself with just the ambient light in your room. So every time you look over at it, you get a new perspective. And all of this happens without any messy cables or cords. Instead, a couple of hidden magnets within the globe help keep the globe spinning. And if you're looking for a particular style, MOVA Globes likely has it. There are currently over a dozen styles of world for you to choose from, in addition to globes featuring all the other planets in our solar system, and special edition collectible globes featuring famous works of art. As part of this sponsorship, you can get 10% off any 6-inch or 8.5-inch MOVA globe of your choice. That's a great deal. All you need to do is click the link in the description below. I hope you enjoyed learning more about how West Virginia and Virginia split apart from each other. If you did, please subscribe to my channel. And if you want to watch more of my videos, you can do so here. Thanks for watching. See you next time.